Tatar. I serve as Deputy Assistant to the President and Coordinator for Intelligence and Defense Policy on the National Security Council staff at the White House. I am thrilled to be in Seoul representing the White House. We are grateful to the Republic of Korea for hosting this year's summit. I'm going to lead off today with some brief remarks regarding the issue of the day for this event titled Galvanizing Multi-Stakeholder Action to Combat the Misuse of Commercial Spyware. And then we're going to hear from our distinguished panel. And after that, we have two members of our joint statement on commercial spyware who will be speaking to wrap up this session as well. President Biden initiated the summit in 2021 because, as he said, democracy doesn't happen by accident. We have gathered here as governments, civil society representatives, and the private sector to continue our focus on actions that can strengthen democracy. And it's for this reason I have the distinct honor today to extend a warm welcome to all of you for participating in the United States' signature event at this third Summit for Democracy. We have chosen to focus on the collective challenge posed by the misuse of commercial spyware. The sophisticated and invasive commercial surveillance technology that can enable users to surreptitiously infect an electronic device remotely and access our most personal information without our knowledge. Proliferation and misuse of this technology presents a direct challenge to the rights and freedoms we champion and seek to defend. 1 year ago, at the second Summit for Democracy, the United States joined an inaugural coalition of 11 like-minded partner nations to announce a joint statement on efforts to counter the proliferation and misuse of commercial spyware. This joint statement was groundbreaking. For the first time, countries from around the world came together to affirm the threat posed by the misuse of commercial spyware and agree to take concrete measures, domestically and collectively, to counter the unregulated spread and misuse of this technology. Before then, even as revelations of abuse became increasingly difficult to ignore, the international community had been unable to mobilize. Silence by governments reigned, vendors exploited inaction, and abuses compounded, sometimes with deadly consequences. The past year has been a turning point in the global response to commercial spyware proliferation and misuse. This year's summit is an opportunity to build on this momentum. Earlier today, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced that Finland, Germany, Ireland, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and Poland have also now joined this joint statement. We are now a growing coalition of 17 like-minded nations and encourage more to join. This is a remarkable step forward, and we are thrilled to have the joint statement countries here today. You will hear from some of them at the end of this session. At the second Summit for Democracy, President Biden underscored that technology should be used, quote, to advance democratic governance, not used to undermine it. Early in the Biden-Harris administration, we recognized that the unique, invasive, and increasingly pervasive threat of commercial spyware posed a distinct challenge. This technology was being misused across the world to target journalists, dissidents, and human rights defenders. It was a thoroughly modern enabler of political repression and human rights abuses by authoritarian regimes and in democracies. At the same time, its proliferation and misuse also posed a significant security and counterintelligence risk for the U.S. government and our own personnel, just as it would for many of your governments. To tackle this threat seriously and comprehensively, we therefore needed to craft a policy response that fused two worlds together that too often are addressed separately: security and human rights. We also led the charge from the National Security Council at the White House. This way, we could bring together all components of our government, from our intelligence, law enforcement, and defense components, to our agencies in charge of diplomacy, export controls, and sanctions. Among our first steps was an intensive internal effort to develop rules to regulate and restrict our own government's use of these tools. Now, we acknowledge that there can be legitimate uses of certain commercial tools in narrow circumstances with robust oversight and due process. But we also acknowledge how easily these tools can be abused. And we did not want the US government using tools from vendors that pose national security risks, endanger the civil liberties of Americans, or enable human rights abuses abroad. For instance, we did not want one part of the US government doing business with a spyware vendor that at the same time was enabling use of their tools against our own diplomats or our own citizens, effectively subsidizing surveillance of our own citizens and personnel. That work culminated with a new executive order signed by President Biden in advance of last year's Summit for Democracy. For the first time, the executive order prohibits US government agencies from using commercial spyware that pose a significant counterintelligence threat or poses risks of improper use, including to target Americans or enable human rights abuses. As President Biden explained at the time during his remarks at the Second Summit for Democracy, quote, US taxpayer dollars should not support companies that are willing to sell their products to abet human rights violations, end quote. Now, over the past year, we've moved methodically to apply the full range of US government authorities and tools to hold accountable commercial spyware vendors that enable misuse, and those who financially benefit from this misuse. In July, the US Department of Commerce placed new export controls on additional commercial spyware vendors, following an initial tranche of entity list designations in November of 2021. Last month, the Department of State announced a new unprecedented visa ban policy to block entry to the United States for individuals involved with or who have enabled or profited from commercial spyware misuse. And earlier this month, the US Treasury Department imposed financial sanctions on 5 entities and 2 individuals involved with a notorious commercial spyware consortium. This is the first time that the US government has leveraged financial sanctions against actors involved in commercial spyware misuse. Together, these actions send a clear message. Irresponsible business practices that pose a counterintelligence threat to the United States and that enable human rights abuses globally will be met with clear consequences. Now, throughout, we have also prioritized working with like-minded governments and stakeholders outside of the government. In addition to the joint statement, we worked with 59 other countries at the Human Rights Council to issue in October a statement on heightened risks associated with surveillance technologies and the importance of safeguards. 2 weeks ago, the White House convened investors for a novel dialogue on responsible technology investment, including with respect to commercial spyware. At this event, the investors announced a set of voluntary principles and commitments to guide investments in ways that promote the values of free and open societies. One of those investors is here for our panel today. And this week, the State Department is releasing guidance with steps technology companies can take to prevent their platforms and products from being misused to target human rights defenders. Now, we are also encouraged by mutually reinforcing work undertaken by civil society and the private sector. For many years, civil society organizations like Citizen Lab, Access Now, and Amnesty International have exposed spyware misuse and provided direct support to those targeted. Philanthropies are also increasing funding for organizations that seek to promote accountability and support victims. 2 weeks ago, leading philanthropies in the United States, including the Ford Foundation, announced in partnership with Apple and other companies $4 million in grants globally for this important work. And finally, technology companies have also conducted forensic investigations to expose misuse, notify victims, and publish detailed reports on incidents and trends. The author of one of those reports is also here today. Now, on today's panel, we want to highlight this unique convergence of work by governments and a diverse set of stakeholders, and discuss how we build on the momentum we've all generated. So on that note, please welcome our panel, and we're going to begin our moderated discussion. Let me make sure that this works. I think it does. Now, it was critical for us to invite speakers representing a diverse range of perspectives. A journalist who was targeted by commercial spyware, a journalist who feared for her life while working to uncover shocking revelations about the prevalence of commercial spyware infections, a member of the investor community involved in steering responsible investments, a representative from a leading technology company involved in exposing commercial spyware. So today we're joined by these esteemed individuals. Ricardo Avalar, a journalist with El Salvadorian media outlet Revista Factum. Jamil Jaffer, here in his capacity as a venture partner and strategic advisor with investment firm Paladin Capital Group. Shane Huntley, the director of Google's Threat Analysis Group. And Aya Ibrahim, the co-founder and CEO of Deraj, an independent digital media platform and one of the reporters behind the Pegasus Files. I'd also like to introduce my co-moderator, Kelly Razouk, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Democracy and Human Rights at the White House's National Security Council.
Thanks so much, Maher. Can you hear me?
Try now.
Thanks so much, Maher. That's working. And thank you to all of you for being here today. Ricardo, I wanted to start with you. As Maher said, it was so important for us to have someone on this panel who was a victim of commercial spyware. And we would love to hear from you your story, how you felt when you first learned that you were a victim of commercial spyware and what that meant to you and also to the people around you.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you so much for your invitation. It's an honor to be part of this very important panel. November 24, 2021. I was getting ready for an editor's meeting at the newspaper I was working at back then in El Salvador. This is 2.5 years after the new president arrived. You may have heard of him as the Bitcoin president, Nayib Bukele. And the first thing we noticed is that besides all of the promises to make El Salvador a safer and more modern country, there was a certain animosity against the press, and the president was making significant effort to blocking access to information and being very aggressive towards journalists. So we did have some suspicions that they may have been targeting us, that they may have been listening to our conversations. But on November 24th, 2021, I got this email. You probably cannot see it. I'm happy to show it to you closer. And it's an email from Apple that says, state-sponsored attackers may be targeting your iPhone. Now, the first time I heard about this, I was getting ready for this meeting, and one of my sources, this young politician, the opposition, called me and sent me the photo at the same time. So he called me and he said, can you look at the photo I just sent you? And I said, I saw this. And honestly, to be quite frank to you, the first thing that came to my mind was, it sucks to be you. And then 30 minutes later, I got the email myself. And the first thing that came to my mind, you, of course, tell it talks to me. And then, a lot of things happen. A lot of things cross your mind when you hear that your phone is being targeted. Because effectively, what this means is that I was doing practically this to my government, giving my phone up fully unlocked for them to do whatever they wanted. And so the question arises, what is the first thing you do when they tell you that your phone is hacked? Do you call your sources? Do you inform your editors, your bosses, the publisher at the paper? Or do you call your family first? Do you call your parents and tell them that all of their information is available? All of the times that I had sent something on Uber Eats to my parents' house, they have the address. The times I spoke to a doctor, they know it. Do you tell your partner? And how do you explain to your parents, or your partner, or your group of friends from high school that they now have to use Signal and they have to use self-destructing messages? So, what I'm trying to say here is that they targeted us for work in journalism, but they impacted all of our lives, our personal lives. Suddenly, you don't have privacy anymore. If your entire life is on your phone, then your entire life is in their control. And beyond all of that, beyond all the personal implications of having been spied and having to explain to everyone that now you cannot communicate with me in certain terms and blah, 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 there's the next problem. Your sources don't want to talk to you anymore. In El Salvador, we have seen a growing number of people who have decided to remain silent, including one of the most important think tanks in Latin America. Very important for its research on democracy, on the rule of law, on economics, and social policies. 3 years ago, they decided not to say anything else publicly. Some sources won't even speak to us off the record due to fears of being listened to, being followed, being harassed, due to fears of being persecuted. So effectively, what is happening in El Salvador is the journalists no longer have access to credible sources, or we have, but it's very limited access to credible sources. It's funny that some of the sources that still speak to us are also in the Pegasus group, as we call it in El Salvador, or the Pegasus class of 21. And so obviously we lose as journalists. Our media outlets lose because we have, our articles are no longer as sustained as they used to be. But we're not the biggest losers there. The entire country is now blindfolded due to a certain group of people deciding to use, and this, mind you, this is a very poor country with very limited resources. And I don't know, some of you may know more about the cost of Pegasus, but I would assume it is not cheap. So the entire society is losing, one, because those significant funds are being redirected to listening to our conversations and not social programs to improving the lives of people, but also because we now do not know. We cannot shed light as effectively as we could have before because this happened, and because fear, because a lot of our colleagues have decided to also leave journalism, and some of our colleagues have also decided to leave the country. So that is my experience with Pegasus. I am still doing journalism in El Salvador, now based in London. A lot of my colleagues have stopped. They moved on to something else, academia or something else. And it is the entire Salvadoran society that is losing important sources of information and access. And as I like the title of this conference, Democracy for Future Generations. Future generations in El Salvador will see tainted democracy, if any at all.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Thank you for sharing that and for not staying silent and for sharing your important story with all of us here today. Alia, I wanted to turn to you just to build a little bit on that. I know that you're a journalist also. Your media organization, Dadaj, also contributed to the Pegasus project and exposed widespread abuse of spyware. Based on your reporting, how have these revelations of commercial spyware intrusions affected the abilities of journalists, of human rights defenders, of opposition candidates to be able to do their work?
Thank you so much. Well, when we started working on the Pegasus papers before publication, we were living this story in our heads, and there was fear. For us, being in Beirut at the time, I was personally working on two other very important and very sensitive files. One of them was about capital and trade, and the other one was about, we were investigating our central bank governor. Two very dangerous files before publication. Afterwards, if it's already out there, we're not as scared. But having to work on the idea of, we checked our phones. I knew my phone was not targeted, but still the idea that this is out there, this kind of spyware is out there, I just became paranoid. And my days were okay. During the day, I would live my life, do my work, etc. But the nights were becoming incredibly. It was probably just feeling too paranoid. I had to change my house, live in a. This is Beirut also. Despite it being the best place in the region, it can be a violent city. So for me to be able to sleep at night, I had to change apartments. What that means for me, for my teenage daughters, this idea of, I've covered wars as a journalist, but you go to a war, you do your diligence, it's for a while and then you go home. In this case, home was feeling like you could be a target at any minute. After publication, and in the following month, I'm going to mention just some example to tell you, we're a very small newsroom and we are a small team relatively. But in my small circle of colleagues and friends, there's at least a couple of dozen journalists, lawyers, human rights activists that I know personally and work with who have been targeted. All of these people work on really very important issues. Rana Sabah and Lara Dimis from OCCRP, with whom we were working also on the Credit Suisse files, were targeted. Rana had to go through a depression. This idea of when you become a journalist in our part of the world, you're being spied on. I belong to the generation where we used on our phones, make jokes, and knowing that we are spied on. But this is a completely another level. Mostly because it doesn't only compromise us, it compromises, we chose to be journalists, so this is part of the general deal. But when you compromise the lives of people you love and care, and it's their privacy as well, and they did not make that choice, and most of the time they're not even happy that you made that choice. So suddenly they're paying the price for what they consider you being reckless, you being not caring too much about your own security. So there is all of that, the guilt feeling of compromising people's privacy. And there are very tangible examples that I'm going to mention on how this worked. Hajar Rasyuni, who is one of our journalists, her data was used, and then she, in Morocco, she was sentenced for a year in prison for having an illegal abortion, along with her fiancé, who is a university professor. Omar Radi is still in prison till today. Mostly information from his phone was used against him, and some of his friends were also targeted, and they were blackmailed to testify against him in sexual harassment, and then he got 6 years of prison. The example in Egypt, for example, the spyware Predator, not Pegasus, was used, and we're talking here also about mass surveillance. And not only it was used by intelligence groups to identify activists and human rights lobbyists or journalists or whatever, it was also used in a TV show where it was exposed, like to make the public opinion. Of course, it was part of a whole conspiracy that these people are all spying on Egypt, giving information to compromising national security, etc., etc. But the information that was collected was put on TV in a show called The Black Box. So there was even no shame in how the information, private information again, manipulated, taken out of context, and then used against these people. Now, when despite all the challenges, I mean, we're talking about the region 12 years almost after the Arab Spring, the fact that there are still people who are, after all the violence and the pushback that has been put against them, still trying to do this work. The fact that the governments, the dictatorships are being enabled by this kind of technology, which is making them, yani, if I look back, I covered the Arab Spring and it was already very difficult at the time. But if I look at how much more powerful the dictators are today, mostly because of technological support they've been getting, one would ask, how is this going to ever work? How could fighters for freedom, fighters for accountability, fighters for justice, fighters for, how are we ever going to have the slightest chance of making any breakthrough if we're going to be compromised, and when it's partners from all over the world. I mean, and our governments are being sold these technologies by governments that are supposed to be democracies. How it's being used, how it's influencing this whole ecosystem is something that it makes it very difficult to believe that it's still worth it to fight the fight. We continue to fight it because, in all honesty, we don't have a choice. The alternative is even worse. But the fact that knowing that this enablement that what we're standing against is makes it very difficult to continue to fight.
Thank you so much, Alia, for that. And I'd like to come back to both you and Ricardo at the end to talk about some of the solutions and what the multi-stakeholder community can do to help here. But I'll turn it back over to Maher for that set.
Thank you, and thank you as well for sharing your moving stories and for the extremely important work you've done investigating these intrusions. This helps pivot to the next part of our conversation, which is the ways in which other parts of this multi-stakeholder community are taking action in this domain. So I'd like to start with Shane. Google recently released its annual report on cyber intrusions. Can you share with this group here today what you found and what role technology companies like Google play in identifying and addressing these intrusions?
Firstly, thanks for having me here today. This is such a powerful topic, and I feel sort of humbled by being on stage with these moving stories of people directly affected by this work. So from our perspective, I got into computer security to protect people and defend people, and that's the mission of Google's threat analysis group and our security team, is to defend Google and our users. And these spyware threats represent a very serious threat to our users. And now, along with specific missions about government-backed threats and information operations, we have a specific area looking at these commercial surveillance vendors and the exploits that they use. And we just put out this major report called Buying Spying. This is what we think one of the more comprehensive reports which really outline the full scope of this problem. It's not just one or two vendors, but it's actually a fairly interconnected web of different companies kind of selling these capabilities to multiple stakeholders, to multiple countries for various purposes. And we also partnered with our colleagues at Jigsaw to pull together some of the stories like you've heard today about the serious effects of this work. And I think besides the fact of the scope of this activity, I think what we've managed to highlight is that these really represent a serious threat because like in the past, these serious cyber capabilities were the sort of, you had to be the NSA or like a small number of nations with very sophisticated capabilities themselves. Now, because of these vendors, you are seeing kind of almost any country without a good rule of law, without the sort of oversight of other countries, able to use these capabilities against the journalists, against the civil society, and against their political opponents. And what we've also seen is the technological sophistication is very impressive. As has been pointed out by previous research, the Pegasus, the forced entry exploit that was used a number of years against iPhones was one of the most sophisticated exploits ever seen by our Project Zero team. And in fact, what we're seeing is one of the biggest things we're trying to do is to actually make this stuff technically hard. We're trying to find these capabilities, We're trying to actually fix the underlying problems. We're trying to block them using all of our mechanisms, and then also expose them so others, such as governments, can take action. But what we're seeing last year is over half of the zero-day exploits, these are the most powerful exploits used against our products, are actually coming from these commercial surveillance vendors, these spyware vendors. So we're seeing that the real risks to users worldwide are now coming from these specific vendors, and that means nobody is safe. If they have these capabilities to take over any phone at will, then it's not just, and I wouldn't say just, but it's not only journalists, it means everybody has to fear. It means the only thing that's keeping you safe is somebody not being willing to pay the money to do these capabilities. And we don't think that's a world you want to live in, so that's why we're exposing these capabilities and why we're taking on it as a very serious security priority to disrupt these operations.
Thank you, Shane. Just to build on this aspect you just described, kind of the role of capital in ensuring that these companies are able to operate. The U.S. Office of the Director of National Intelligence released a report a few months ago that referenced the role of investors in the commercial spyware industry. And many of these companies survive on the consistent flow of capital and upfront investments to support relevant infrastructure and personnel costs. I'd like to turn to Jamil, since you're here as a representative of the investment community. If you can you walk us through what you think the appropriate role of the investment community is in combating the misuse of commercial spyware? And then also, your firm, along with several others, announced recently voluntary commitments on safe, secure and trustworthy cyber, AI, and other digital technology, including commercial spyware.
Yeah, Maher, thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to you and Kelly for hosting this panel. I think it's worth noting that when you hear some of the stories that Kelly brought out from Ricardo and Alia, what you realize is that for far too long, financial investors have sat back and looked at this environment as simply a way to make economic gain. The time for that is over. It is time now for financial investors who benefit from the free flow of capital, from the benefit of free and open societies that allow them to invest capital freely, to defend those societies, to defend those values. And that's why Paladin Capital and the 9 other investors that stood up with us at the White House 2 weeks ago on March 7th came out to say, we're no longer going to invest, not that those groups ever have, but we're going to stand with other investors and say that we're not going to invest in adversary capabilities. We are going to invest in allied capabilities, and we're going to invest in the values of free and open societies. This is a critical new step. It's what really constitutes what it means to be trusted capital. It's investing in trust, safety, and security. Because at the end of the day, these values not only support the societies in which we're able to invest capital freely, but they also support good returns for our investors. So it's not just about defending our values, which is critical and important in and of itself, but it's about defending effective and successful returns for those that invest with us. These are good investments for business, they're good investments for our societies, and they're good investments for all of our allies. And that's why we think it's important to not just think about this from a US perspective or a NATO perspective, but to look across the Atlantic and across the Pacific to our allies here in Asia, to our allies in Europe, and say that it's time now for industry, represented by companies like Google, for investors, represented by investors like us, and civil society and governments to come together and really make common cause around these values. Because at the end of the day, our adversaries are investing in these capabilities, and they're using them for problematic purposes. It's time for us to stand up and be counted.
Thanks, Jamil. I think what you've hit on right here also is that, at least in the context of commercial spyware, there is a unique moment, this unique convergence that's happening between governments with the expansion of the joint statement on commercial spyware that many of those here today have signed on to, but also with efforts by civil society and by technology companies to expose this work, as well as by journalists, and now governments taking concrete action in this space. If I can, Shane, just quickly to turn to you again. Google was a signatory to the Cybersecurity Tech Accord Principles limiting offensive operations in cyberspace, which was around the second Summit of Democracy last year. And you announced a range of voluntary commitments to cyber intrusions with other companies. Can you walk us through in this group here how Google looks at steps to protect journalists and human rights defenders, and also to notify users about those?
So we've been doing this a while, and been trying to lead the way. So Google was the first company to detect and disclose the use of commercial spyware, both publicly and direct to the victims. And we continue to notify victims when they're compromised, and we try and, as with these major reports, we try and be as transparent as possible to outline what we know. Over 10 years ago, I established the government-backed attacker warnings, which was a real, I think, a watershed moment in the first time actually identifying to users, letting them know they were targeted. Not even if they were compromised, but any time that we saw a user targeted by a government-backed threat actor, we believe that the users should know that, and then we've been informing those. And we see that too. Most of this is phishing versus spyware, but we see like tens of thousands of users a year that we've been warning for over a decade now. We focus very heavily on also the protecting of high-risk users, and we see that like many users have a lot at stake, as has been outlined here already today. And so we are building protections for those users, both behind the scenes, but also programs like our advanced protection, security keys, different programs that allow people to really be able to trust their security of their devices and their accounts by providing the tools that allow them to do that. We're also providing free virtual training and partnering with a lot of different sort of external organizations to do that. I think one of the challenges we go forward in this, though, is that we are continuing to learn more. The attackers are adapting. While we are disrupting their operations and finding their exploits, they are aware that we are after them. So this is a cat and mouse game, and we'll continue to counter them. We also need to keep certain things confidential, exactly what we know, but we make a very strong presence, a very strong commitment that our primary focus is to defend our users and to keep them safe.
Jamil, please go ahead.
Yeah, you know, I think one of the things I think is unique about this moment, Maher, you began with this, that we're in a unique moment. And I think what's particularly unique about this moment is you have an opportunity now for investment capital to become an instrument of national power, an instrument of allied power, where we're taking our values and really putting them to work, not just through governments, not just through civil society, but through financial investors as well. And it's not just about commercial spyware, although that's an important part of the story. It's also about core trust, safety, and security. It's about building capabilities that are secure and resilient by design, about using responsible AI. We're in an era of dramatic innovation. AI presents an opportunity to transform the way our societies operate for good. There's been a lot of talk about the potential challenges and threats of AI. I'm frankly very bullish about the opportunities that AI presents to raise all boats and give opportunities to vast parts of our societies. At the same time, it's important that we build in and bake in that trust, safety, and security. So, and the investment community is a key part of that. So standing on the sidelines, again, is not an option. Now's an opportunity for us to collaborate, come together, and make this one of the tools of our societies to really effectuate this opportunity.
Great, thanks, Jamil. Kelly, before I turn to you to hear from Alia and Ricardo, maybe a couple of quick observations from the conversation that just happened over here. One is, I think, commercial spyware has surfaced how considerations by governments around security and counterintelligence threats, as well as human rights threats, can align and converge together. And I think that is something that we, the US government, have taken to heart. The second is that clearly there is an intensive effort to expose misuse of these tools. And the work by journalists and by companies like Google and others are vital in this space. And then finally, that if you look at where we've come over 2 years, collective action in this space by governments, as well as with other stakeholders, can start building the international consensus and momentum that can truly make a difference. But Kelly, let me turn to you.
Thanks, Maher. And we wanted to give Alia and Ricardo the last word on this. Based on the discussions that you've heard today, I wanted to ask both of you, what more can the multi-stakeholder community do to include governments, civil society, the private sector, businesses, to better support journalists and activists who are victims of commercial spyware abuse or who are being targeted? Alia, let's start with you.
I think the most important thing from, again, where I'm standing is consistency from the international community. What happens usually, this is something Maher mentioned, when it comes to having to decide what's more important, stability or human rights and freedom of speech, usually what gets compromised is the latter. And this has created a sense of it becomes very difficult to feel that anything is gonna happen or change within large societies. So there must be a consistency in the rhetoric, in the agendas, in the diplomacy, and it needs to be communicated properly. People are losing faith in, I mean, even people who believed in democracy and continue to believe in democracy, they feel there is, it's not paying off, it's not working, basically, mostly because of that. Because yes, we mentioned stability and human rights, but there is also a commercial side to this equation. A lot of money is being made by a lot of companies. And I think I'm inspired when I hear you speak, because if I look at the Arab digital population, it's one of the fastest growing. There is a lot of ways to invest and make a lot of money also, but doing good things, not necessarily creating tools that are very nasty and very evil and harm people's life. There is a lot of opportunities to make huge investment in a very unserved market. The other thing is, I think, yes, living up to it, basically, defending it, and regulations, of course. Till now, even what's available, sanctions are excellent. They have a very good feedback, but we need much more. It's a race. It always seems, even in the case of Predator, for example, there is a legal case, there are investigations in France, but it's always, it seems to be 5 steps behind. So we need more, and we need more efficiency and faster regulations. And honestly, I think in countries that don't use these tools properly, just ban them until it's figured out how they can use them properly. I think they need to be banned. And most of dictatorships should not be allowed to have these spywares.
Thanks, Alia. Ricardo.
Right. Not often do I have the chance to speak to a room full of people with such influence, so this is my letter to Santa. As Maher said, the misuse of spyware is now exposed, and it continues to be exposed. And the question we should ask ourselves is, now what? We know it. We have the information. How can we stop it? How can we do something beyond just, acquiring the information? Because the underlying truth here is that beyond all the technical aspects of it, this is another threat to democracy and another threat to our ability to know what's happening with our public funds. I have two things. I have millions, but I'm going to focus on 2. First of all, support independent journalism. We are not all outlets are lucky to be owned by Jeff Bezos, so for the rest of us that are, struggling, may I remind you that this is probably one of the least lucrative industries in the world, but it's one of the most important ones. And a lot of media outlets are going out of business. And every day there's a new journalist who will lose their job. And every day there's a new newsroom that will be forced to shut down, or think about shutting down, or close its print operations, or reduce its scope, its impact. And that doesn't only affect that society, it affects us all. So please support independent journalism. Please find ways to redirect funds to those newsrooms that are, the life of our democracy. And the second one, and I'm going to be really quick, My favorite movie is Casablanca. One of my favorite lines in Casablanca is, "Excuse me, gentlemen, your business is politics, mine is running a saloon." I know that for some of you, your business is diplomacy and politics. Fortunately, that is not mine. My business is telling stories and trying to shed light on those areas that some politicians went dark. And I have found very often that, sadly, there are a lot of instances in which, by our actions or inactions, we enable autocrats and authoritarian governments by not calling them out, by not identifying that we all know how autocracies end. We know the end of the story. We know that it ends with a lot of people running away from their countries, with impoverished societies, with exile, with graveyards full of critics and freethinkers. But we don't always know how the story starts. Sometimes it starts with a power grab, with a coup. Sometimes it starts with an election and then subverting democracy from within. But I would ask you, please, when you first identify that a government is subverting democracy, that a government is following the autocratic path, call them out. Call them by their names. Do not give autocracy second, third, or fourth chances, because they will only disappoint you second, third, or fourth time. So, if I can ask for two things from all of you, is one, support independent journalism, and two, call things by their names. Journalists, we try to be as accurate and precise as possible. And I believe that democratic societies should do the same thing. Let's not sugarcoat autocrats anymore. Let's not sugarcoat what they are doing. Because what we will end up with is a few fortunate journalists, freethinkers, and human rights defenders who will have the chance to leave their countries and operate freely from a free society. But the rest do not escape. And most impoverished citizens do not escape. And they are forced to live in impoverished and controlled societies. And that is, as, again, democracy for future generations. That is not the way to build democracy. Enabling autocrats is not the way to build democracy for the future. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists. To conclude the session today, I'd like to first invite the Poland's Deputy Foreign Minister to deliver the brief special remarks. Poland is one of the new signatories to the joint statement on commercial spyware.
Thanks, Maher, and thank you all for having us here. It is my privilege to confirm that by the decision of the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, Poland has endorsed the joint statement on efforts to counter the proliferation and misuse of commercial spyware. And we thank the government of the United States for inviting Poland and the government of the Republic of Korea for hosting these events. And please believe me that it is particularly important for us to be here in this room and to be with you because the abusive practices which have taken place in my country quite recently and they are connected to the use of the malicious spyware are currently under parliamentary and criminal investigation. And on a very personal note, I was moved by listening to the stories of Ricardo and Dalia. And it was not only because your stories and your personal testimonies touched our hearts, and it is not only because out of human solidarity, but I find a lot of similarity of your stories to other, cases like yours, happening in other places in the world, targeting members of the political opposition, the journalists, representatives of civil society. All of those stories, including ones that happened in my country, have certain degree of similarity. And a quick response to you, Ricardo. You asked how much does it cost. In our case, it was $5 million, plus, I'll say, some extra millions for individual subscription. I'm a diplomat by career. And believe me, diplomacy is also about ethics and about the ethical conduct of international relations. Not always, but as long as we stand by it, it is relevant and it is important for all of us. So as you see, our road, our path to this room was found by the hardest possible way. And if you allow me, here comes our statement of conviction. The government of Poland firmly supports the commitments and actions of the signatories of the joint statement, aimed at prevention, prohibition and persecution of possible misuse of commercial spyware. We cannot allow our democracy to be undermined by this kind of malicious actions. Misuse of commercial spyware is one of the malpractices, putting at risk the very foundations of democratic systems. Respect for universal human rights, the rule of law, civil rights and civil liberties. To counter such threats on a national level, we need to secure participation of all stakeholders, public administration, industry, academia, and civil society. To counter such threats on the international level, we need to cooperate closely within the group of trusted and like-minded countries. Responsibility and accountability are key principles which must guide our political actions. Democratic governments need to protect citizens and refrain from using constitutional prerogatives to abuse public trust. We need to secure the rule of law, appropriate legal authorization, solid safeguard, and proper oversight. And that will strengthen our democracy. That comes hand in hand with the protection of human rights. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much for allowing me to speak today. Thank you very much.
If I could just say, on behalf of the United States, it is a truly powerful reflection of that Poland has joined the joint statement, so thank you. So I'd like to end the session today by inviting the Republic of Korea's Ambassador for International Security to provide also brief remarks. And thank you as well to the Republic of Korea for being one of the 6 new signatories to the joint statement.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. Senior Director Akabitar, Senior Director Kelly Lazuk of the U.S. National Security Council, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to first thank the U.S. government for convening this important discussion on misuse of commercial spyware on the occasion of the third Summit for Democracy. I wish to also thank all the speakers for their passionate and insightful contributions today. As we face the realities of rapidly transforming digital landscape, it is increasingly clear that emerging technologies are bringing formidable challenges that require our collective and strategic responses. And the discussions today illustrated the serious dangers posed by the misuse of commercial spyware to our national security, to the right of our citizens, and to the pillars of our democracy. If left unchecked, the commercial spyware market will continue to grow rapidly and uncontrollably. We therefore welcome the U.S. leadership in bringing us together to raise the international awareness on the threat and discuss ways to counter this misuse. And this crucial mission requires strong international cooperation that brings together all the relevant stakeholders, including governments, the private sector, and civil society. In this regard, the deliberation today highlighted the need for a multi-stakeholder partnership to raise awareness and set appropriate standards for the responsible use of technologies. We can begin by sharing information on the threats and tools to identify and address the misuse of spyware. We could also consider ways to better align our relevant policies to exchange experiences on how to build the necessary capacity. And more importantly, these collective efforts must be guided by our shared fundamental values, including human rights, freedom, and rule of law. And as we aspire to become a global pivotal state, the Republic of Korea is committed to working closely with partners to lead this effort. With this in mind, Korea has signed a joint statement on countering the proliferation and misuse of commercial spyware. Let me conclude by congratulating everyone for this successful event. Thank you.
And on that note, thank you again. again. We greatly appreciate it.